koutou katoa, nau mai hoki mai ki tēnei kaupapa, ko Borni te Rongopai Tukiwaho tōku ingoa, ko te Kaiārahi o te ora auaha aho. Kia ora everybody, welcome back if you joined us before in our first two episodes of the webinar. And for anyone who this is your first time, welcome. My name is Borni te Rongopai Tukiwaho, and I am here to introduce our new friends that will be a part of our third episode for this part of the webinar series, 2021. I'm not going to be a huge part of this kōrero. I'm going to leave it to our friends, Dr. Renee Liang and Lucy Day, and they will give you some perspectives around storytelling and how we can respond to the situation that we all finding ourselves in at the moment. Auntie Rona, kia ora koutou. Hei a tērā tau, see you next year, 2022. Ka kite.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Lucy Day tōku ingoa. I'm Lucy Day. I've been a New Zealander for 25 years, but I was born in England. Ko Ōtautahi taku kāinga in INA. I am very proud of being from Ōtautahi and all the things that this wee city has been through over the last 10 years, which have taught me so much through the earthquakes and the horror of the terrorism, and have forged a body of wellbeing work, which I've been really proud to be part of the community working on that. So I work for the Public Health Unit. I'm a health promoter by trade and a public health specialist by role. And at the moment, all our work is around COVID-19, particularly supporting the heroic people in the Auckland Regional Public Health Service who are right at the front of things. My agenda is I'm really interested in how our health system could become more health promoting and pay better honour to the ways in which arts and creativity might broker well-being for individuals and communities. I'm really interested in that. And in my practice, I'm very happy to partake of any arts that are on the go. I love to engage with any kind of art, but my own practice is mostly based around words and particularly poetry.
Đại ca hảo, 我嘅名係梁文慧. So I'm Renee Liang. I'm a Cantonese New Zealander, and I am a paediatrician. So that's one of my interests in this conversation around health, because we spend a lot of time chatting to families about their health. And also with one of my other hats, I am a writer. That's the short version. The longer version is that I started in poetry, got drawn into theatre, and now I'm really, really interested in exploring all the different forms of writing, and especially the ones that will help me with science communication.
Our storytelling, we are storied people. We're born in story and shaped by story, and so the stories are how we set ourselves in the context, and they're amazingly pliable. You know, I'm aware that when people introduce themselves or say their pepeha, they can say different things depending on who they think is there, and then when they find out who's listening, they'll respond and change. We change our stories to make ourselves have things in common or to have differences. And so that's a really fascinating environment in which we live, the environment of words. And so in order to be good storytellers, we also need to be good listeners. You know, if I think about the stories of liberation, which have allowed me to live the life that I currently live, sometimes they, I came out 30 plus years ago into a very different world, a world where it was a much harder story to tell, and you were much less sure about who was listening and how they were listening, and I've lived through a revolution, you know, not there yet, but a revolution in terms of what stories can be honored and listened to, even if people don't necessarily share the experience. And so I'm really interested in the healing power of being able to speak our own truth and have our own truth listened to and listened into existence, because some stories are really hard to tell, to put words around them. And so you asked about responsibility, the responsibility to listen and to clarify and to tentatively offer, you know, did I hear you say this? No, not that. Okay. Oh, this, because I talk my way into existence, and I am listened into existence. And, you know, those great myths that hold us, many different myths, they kind of contradict each other, but who cares? I mean, it's a glorious kaleidoscope of stories that we're held in. And yet when you know that someone has told you something very precious about themselves, then that's a link between you that holds you. And that's where wellness happens, I think.
As a doctor and then as a writer, I have been very interested in stories. In fact, when people ask me, how can I do such different things? I actually remind them of my realization that, in fact, I'm doing the same thing. I am listening to stories, I guess processing them, and then working with the owner of the story to tell it a different way or to tell it anew. So I've always been interested in stories. I love watching for narrative patterns because they're everywhere. And then there's something really cool about spotting that pattern and then using it to connect with other humans. I think that listening to and then receiving a story back of yourself is very therapeutic. In fact, it may be the most therapeutic part of, for example, an encounter with a doctor, having someone listen to your story and then speak it back to you and check if it's true. And that's something that we try to do, even though doctors traditionally haven't had a very good reputation for listening. So when I work on a story together with someone, whether that be a fellow artist or my patient, I see that my listening to their story and helping them with it gives them agency. And I think that's really important to understand. So moving to responsibilities, remember that a story is part of someone, just like their heart or their face is part of them. It belongs to them and to them only. So just like what if you would respect someone's body, you wouldn't talk about a story, try to control someone's story or take someone's story without their permission. We sometimes use words in medicine like respect and confidentiality, but in reality, I think it goes much deeper and wider than that. It is at the heart, understanding that somebody has control over their own story, and that's very important to their health and their sense of self. It also is possible to have more than one story about the same thing. So we're seeing this a lot at the moment in the situation that we're dealing with. And it's really useful to remember that for any one thing, one person's story about it is going to shine brighter for them than everybody else's story about it. And that's something, a bit of knowledge that you can use. So this is a huge question for lots of people right now. It feels like we were once unified and now we are splitting among ourselves. And a lot of this are internal fractures really based on essentially the stories that we have about the pandemic. And I guess for me, it is part of my job to have conversations with vaccine hesitant families. And not just about the COVID vaccine, but generally about protecting their children. And this is a very, very emotional thing. So it's important to understand that, firstly, keeping story first and foremost, and also respecting someone's story and waiting until they're ready to have that discussion is important. But at the same time, there's that, I guess, that sense of urgency as well, which is definitely affecting, especially the Māori and Pacific community who have seen this kind of thing before. They've had to deal with pandemics before, and they've also got to deal with, I guess, a lot of feelings that they have, which are very conflicted about their interaction with the health system and with government in general in this country. And I acknowledge the fear and hesitancy and the mistrust that is driving a lot of this hesitancy. And I know I also set this very differently from people that I guess have access to the right information and have had time to process it, but still choose not to go with it for various reasons. So here are a few things I've learned, and these are conversations that anyone can have, definitely not just a health professional. These are tools for everyone. So here are the words you're going to use: connection, compassion, and commitment. And there's one final word which I'm going to repeat, and that word is protection. So you don't need much knowledge about COVID. You don't need to be a doctor or a scientist. You just need to have a connection with that person that you are talking to as a friend or as a family member. It's important to know, and we'll go into this later, that these conversations can use a lot of energy. So make sure that you have the resource to have that conversation at that time. It's okay not to have that conversation right away. You have to have the resources. And also, you don't have to do it for everyone. Make sure that you have those conversations, give the time and energy to the people that you love most. And these are the steps. Firstly, you need to identify if that person is actually keen for the vaccine, but they just haven't had time to access it. If they're a fence sitter, if they're hesitant, and this is the majority of people that haven't had the vaccine. And the third group are the people that absolutely don't want to talk about it. They're completely against it. They've already thought about it. They are not keen. They're not on the fence at all. So if they're keen, obviously find out why they haven't got it. Is it because they need transport? Is it because they're a little bit needle phobic and they just need a friend to hold their hand? That kind of thing. You can be that person. If they're hesitant, then this is where your connection is really, really important. Ask them if they want to talk about it. Maybe they're scared. Maybe they've heard something and you can help find the right information for them. Maybe they've got a health issue or a past response that they're really frightened of repeating. And again, you can help them access the right information, the right advice. Maybe they're in a social group where someone is spreading fear and misinformation, and you can help get them out of that social group and see a new environment. You are their friend and their family member, and you can ask open-ended questions, not be judgmental, by being compassionate, by listening, and you might be able to pull them a little way towards seeing clearly for themselves that it's okay to change their story about what the vaccine is. If they're completely against it, then you also have a role, and that is to make sure that you maintain your connection with them without judgment. Don't talk about the vaccine, talk about all the other things that you love together. Keep the friendship and the love open for the next time. Maybe if they do have second thoughts, you are the first person that they'll go to. So going back to the vaccine hesitant group, I'm going to use that word protection again. So this is the word that you use constantly. So for example, if they're scared or if they've got a piece of information, misinformation, and it is entrenching them in their views, then sometimes if you actually directly challenge that with some other piece of information, you're actually going to entrench them further in their views because it threatens their sense of self. It's called cognitive dissonance. So you don't want to do that. You don't want to challenge their sense of self. You want to focus on what the benefits of vaccination are, and that is protection. That is protection for themselves, for the people they love, including their elderly and their children, protection for their community that they draw strength from, and also protection for our country and our way of life that we love, and all the things, including the arts, that make life worth living. If you sense that they haven't yet accepted the misinformation, and they're actually just seeking more knowledge, then there are actually a lot of things that you can help them access. For example, trustworthy websites, including the covid19.govt.nz website, which actually contains a heap of information and is constantly updated with new research evidence. There's really great journalists and scientists writing, for example, Susie Wiles in the Spin-Off, or you can find a trusted person that knows a little bit more just to have a chat to them. So there are lots of things. I can say that there are very few medical conditions that actually completely rule out vaccination, especially now that there are actually several different vaccination choices. Once you've provided that information or support, follow up to check on how they're feeling. Do they need any more help? How do they now feel about protecting their whānau? I think what you'll find is that that strength of connection is what will do it in the end. So, I mean, I'm a doctor. I don't have the same power that you do with your friends or loved ones, because you've known them longer, you know what drives them, and they love you back. So make sure that you go in and you spend the time. It's going to take a little bit of time. It's going to take a few goes probably, but you might be enough to break that circuit of fear and misinformation and to protect them.
Well, if we keep up the theme of stories, the narrative through 2020 was really a coherent narrative. It was the team of 5 million will eliminate COVID from Aotearoa. And of course, there are many subtexts to that story, and, you know, are we a team of 5 million or all that? But actually, that was the story of 2020. And it was a successful story. In terms of epidemiology, we absolutely crushed that curve. But a pandemic works along a certain line, and it's a virus and you can't fight it forever. And so this new stage of the story is much more fractured, because it's, you know, in epidemiological terms, it's a suppression strategy. It's learning to live with the virus, and we are differently equipped to live with the virus depending on how big our house is, how much money we've got, you know, whether we're a victim of racism over 200, 500 years. So the inequity is really marked now, and that is painful to us. This is a very painful story to be part of. And within that is the kind of polarization and the bitterness of the vaccine conversations and the vaccine mandate. I think it's helpful from a health promotion point of view, because, you know, inequity is just such a blight on public health in this country. It was before the pandemic, and the pandemic's thrown it into relief. So I do think about those models of health, Mason Jury's Te Whare Tapawha, Te Pai Mahutonga. Both of them, they're different images. He's a storyteller, Mason Jury. These are images. The one is the Southern Cross, one is the whare, but actually health happens in the space. And in the space, we have to negotiate how to be well together. And we did that relatively well in 2020, and we are finding that much harder conversation now. And I suppose that is why we're tired, and why we're really struggling with the fracturing of one big narrative, and the tension for me in that Te Pai Mahutonga between Ngā Manakura and the other one, which I always forget, Mana Whakahaere, between autonomy and community leadership. It's exactly what Renee's just been talking about. You know, why should I be vaccinated if I don't want to be vaccinated? Well, I should be vaccinated because it's good for all of us if I'm vaccinated. But that's a tension, you know, and so that is a tense story, and we can't override the multiple voices that we hear in that. So individual liberty, if I'm honest, I'm not really such a big fan. I think that my freedom is bound up with everyone else's freedom.
I think the concept of freedom and liberty is, as Lucy says, very based on where you are in the picture and what story you have for your community. So as Lucy has said, this is not a country that's been very good at practicing freedom and equity. And in actual fact, we've plastered over the cracks, but the cracks will always, underneath the ground, were always going to open up at this stage of the pandemic, because the containment regime has failed largely because our health system and our inequity which has been going for decades, if not centuries, and that is actually what the problem is. And in actual fact, the vaccine rollout is also suffering from exactly the same blind spots and systemic biases that all the other health things are. So the big picture is this is more of the same, and that is exactly what our Māori leaders have been saying. And this time they are loud and clear determined that the outcome will be completely different, and we should all be supporting them. They have seen this coming from when COVID first hit last year, and they've been working so hard to be heard, to get the supports they need in place. They're finally getting some of it, but it's way too late. And so there are so many different stories. There's the story that we need to stay the course and listen to the government and trust it. And in some ways I'm the center narrative. Then there's the narrative, we need individual liberty, the right to earn a living by opening my shop and welcoming people. I want to be able to see my friends and family from overseas because emotionally I need this for my health. That's a valid story as well, and that's what the people that are crying freedom are talking about. And again, I agree with Lucy. We have to recognise that story as valid in order for us to be able to have conversation. The third story is the one that is based on history and experience and centuries of inequity. And that's the story that drives the iwi up north who are talking about roadblocks, who are saying, please don't come and have your holiday with us. Please don't visit us. Even our friends and family who know what situation we're in and know how many people died in 1918, where they couldn't hold tangi for people because they were dying too fast and they needed to move on. We don't want that to happen to our community, because this is the lifeblood of our community, our customs and traditions and our beliefs that we have to put aside, and we are currently putting aside. And so those people should be given primacy as well. Their stories are very important because their stories underlie the history and the story of this country. So all three of those types of stories, and of course within that there are individual variations, they need to be listened to. However, I do disagree with the co-opting of words like freedom and liberty by various people for what I'm going to call it selfish reasons. I think these people maybe don't have an understanding of history. They don't understand that when you use words like freedom, freedom actually means freedom for myself and others. So if you have a right, you also have a responsibility. If you are saying, I have the right to self-determination, that term self-determination applies to a group of people, your group of people, your community, but you are like, well, I have the right to determine my own destiny. What you mean is we have the right to determine our own destiny, and also determining our own destiny by its nature also means that you don't impact on the destiny of other people. You try to respect everybody's rights at the same time, because there is always a way forward. And I think for the purposes of this pandemic, there is a way forward. We're slowly finding it. We're going to make mistakes. There's going to be stupid stuff that happens that is the wrong way, and somebody's going to have to say, this is the wrong way. Okay, let's go back. Let's work out a different way. And that's what we're doing right now. And the more that we understand that there are different stories, that we have to work together, and that we can't all accept that all our stories will have primacy all the time. That's how we can work together to find our way. So there are deep cracks. There are ways to fill in those cracks with new earth and new roots, and that's what we need to do.
I think that's where art comes in, doesn't it? Because actually some of the best art, some of the best stories, theatre, opera, it leaves you emotionally drained, doesn't it? It takes you on an emotional journey. That's why That's why we're drawn to it. And I am really interested in emotional literacy. And it's funny to say that in an English accent, because we are traditionally not, we don't operate on a wide emotional range. And certainly we've made a lot of jokes about that in Canterbury since the earthquake. And the wellbeing work that we were involved in was called All Right ? And the question mark starts a conversation about wellbeing. And traditionally, Cantabrians, the conversation goes, all right, all right. And actually, we're really interested in growing emotional literacy. And you're talking about being emotionally drained. And I can completely get that people in Tamaki Makaurau are at the moment. I mean, God, how many weeks of this? It really does do your head in. But actually, I think about, I'm just reflecting on words, because that's what we've said we do. Drainage is really important. The reason why Ōtautahi was hit so badly by the earthquakes is because Pākehā built a city on a swamp. Ngāi Tahu said, not a good idea to build there. That is a braided river, effectively. And so if you build the wrong thing in the wrong place, it's gonna come to grief. But if you manage your emotions to the terrain, which is not easy, easier said than done, then we can come through this together. And so, you know, this is a very sad, hard, tiring time, and we desperately need to take care of ourselves. And one of the other things that we've said in the All Right campaign all the way through is each of us is an expert in our own well-being. You know, what makes me feel good is not necessarily what makes you feel good, but we need to respect that in each other, and we need to grow that expertise, you know. So you know, I think about the currency of poetry. Through this last few years, I have found workmates who will send me a poem when there's no other words, when, you know, it could be obscene or explicit or just deeply moving. Someone has, you know, so in order to drain the emotions and replenish the emotions and process them, art is great in that. And how do we deal with people who see things differently? Well, we all see things differently, and that's all right. You know, there has to be that intrinsic respect, that, you know, some of my mates will run up the Port Hills every weekend for their well-being, and that would kill me. But I will potter about in my garden and smell the roses, and that will replenish me. I think we don't have to be on all the time. We have to trust each other. We have to have relationships where we can say, actually, not today. And so that's the negotiation that we're part of, and that's the collective story, isn't it? And I really don't want to sound trite, because there have been some very bleak times for all of us over the last year, but there have also been many little joys, and I am a big fan of mining the moments of joy.
So I completely agree with Lucy about taking the time for yourself, making sure that whatever you choose to relax, it is for you and not because someone told you it was good for you. And also being kind to yourself and saying, no, I don't have time, I don't have space, I don't have emotional energy right now. And there's this beautiful metaphor I read about, which is about a choir. When a choir sings and sustains a note for a long time, it's not because everyone is singing full blast for that whole period. The people in the choir are, when you run out of breath, you stop singing and you take a breath and rest, while the other people in that choir keep singing. And by doing that, you sustain that note for as long as it takes. And I think it's important to recognize that we are working together, we are part of a team, and it's not just up to you to make that difference. So on the days where you can't, say no. Say, I'm going to tap out now, see you later. I need to take some time to look after myself. There's also the good enough principle. So you don't need to be the best person, the best creative, the best doctor, the best mother, the best dad. that you possibly can be all the time. You can just be good enough that day and just do what it needs for that day to sustain whatever it is you're trying to sustain. That is going to be enough most of the time. The other thing is that remember that we are all human and we have power in our humanity and our connectedness and our ability to perceive stories and to hold them for each other. And again, there is no pressure in being able to do that. There are some days I get out of bed and I am not feeling human at all, and I take 2 coffees until about 3 o'clock in the afternoon to feel human, and that is okay too. And I'm sure it'll be a different thing for everyone. So again, don't let the I'm human, I know stories, I'm connected to people, don't let that pressure you. Just take that time and remember that when you do choose to use that power, it'll be there. So I think it's much less about rejuvenation and more about just knowing ourselves and giving ourselves, I guess, to use that metaphor, the soil and the light to grow. And it's interesting to note that it's not just growth. In order to grow and to change, there's also a dying back that's necessary. So we're going to lose things. That's not so bad if you understand that that helps us to change and to move in a more adaptive direction. So this applies to pandemic, but it also applies to the new and scary environments that we find ourselves in with, say, climate change and political change. So it is about partially accepting and partially receiving the stimulus to change and to grow. Growth does imply change, but the other thing is don't let the pressure for change override your instinct. So people will say things need to change, and it's like, well, maybe they need to change, but not right now for me. I'm happy. That's okay. That's okay to do as well. The other thing that you mentioned about hope is that I guess I see hope as one of the many things that helps people to keep growing. It's one of the lights, to use that metaphor. There are many others. They're called names like story, creativity, care, and connectedness. So I think that all of these things we've been talking about today are different lights that can help each of us to grow, to change, to die back if necessary, and to emerge anew.
I am interested in the word rejuvenation because I think its roots are in becoming young again, and what I've learned over the last couple of years is that I'm quite grateful to be becoming older. Exactly as Renee says, you know, it's a journey, and you have to be open to whatever it brings. And there are some great advantages to getting older. What does it look like to travel this journey well? I think I'm really reliant on friendship and solidarity, you know, and by friendship, I mean the people who help me to grow, especially the people who are not necessarily like me, who, you know, who tell stories from their place that challenge me, that change me. And I think that whilst challenging and tiring is also really very exciting. And so we've been through this, we're going through this remarkable experience as a country and as cities and communities. And I really hope that we can be open to it. And so if we're talking about hope, it's not finished. So there's a possibility for something else to happen. And in that space, I'm really interested in the space where we could do something creative together. You know, the space at the center of Te Whare Tapawhā, where health happens. You know, we, as Renee said, you know, we have a very bad history in this country of not valuing everyone's health and everyone's potential and everyone's mana. And so this next step of the journey, I am hopeful that we can, you know, because it hasn't ended yet. There is hope. You know, the hope that sustains me, which is desperate and urgent hope, is every life we can save. You know, we're going into community spread, and far too many people have died across the world, and far too many people, even albeit a relatively small number in this country, those are lives that we should not have lost. And every life saved, which we'll never be able to measure, is something to hope for, isn't it? That's what drives me. But I'm grateful for the metaphor of the choir, because I know I'm not the only one, and I've got no illusions about my individual power in that. But I have a lot of hope in the collective power of these peoples in this set of islands. Well, the whakatauki that has been precious to us in our conversations in Otatahi is he moana puki puki e ekanea e te waka. Borni, you will say that much better than I, but I love the image of navigating a vessel navigating together choppy seas. You know, it feels like a hopeful thing. And if I go back to my own culture, there's a very old English prayer, oh Lord, be good to me. The sea is so wide and my boat is so small. You know, so that idea that we are navigating a small craft of friends on a difficult sea, I find that an encouraging metaphor. I hope you do too. I hope someone's watching this, and I hope it's useful.
I spend a lot of time watching children grow through, or imagining them grow as well through their life course. And a concept that we have is of an individual who's cradled within their family, who's then cradled within their society and their community, and then finally the environment, and how that surrounds them, and the different layers change over time. You know, they grow or they shrink over time depending on the point of life at which that individual is. But then when I connect to my Cantonese culture, which I'm connecting to, and when I come across other cultures, you know, especially the Māori culture that we've been speaking of today, I understand that actually my story as an individual is also continuous with the story of my ancestors before me, and also my children and their children who are yet to be imagined. And so we are this continuous strand, you know, whether we're in it, we're part of that woven strand or not, we are part of a strand, and we are part of other strands that are interweaving and affecting each other's trajectories. And when you feel part of that unified strand, part of that unified woven cloth that extends through space and time, I think it does feel a little bit comforting. It feels like, if I can just do my strand well, maybe I'll be strong for the whole cloth. Maybe I'll give it a bit of color that it needs at that point. And I really love that idea, and I think it comforts me.
Taka taka te ha ki runga, taka taka te ha ki roro.